Okay, sometimes it takes a few people a few minutes to get on, depending on the link or depending on what's going on. So I'll go ahead and just introduce myself. My name's Terry Harlan. I have taught government or AP government for about 16 years. And I am no longer in the classroom. I'm now just, I own my own company and I tutor and do my own classes full time. So I'm having a really good time with that. I'd like to welcome Arshika, I believe it is, Diana, Jade, Majerly, Peter, and Peter Burke. You have a great last name for government. Edmund Burke was very important in government. But in any case, welcome to Wyzant's AP test prep session. Let's get started. Remember, feel free to drop your questions in the chat at any time. This is an interactive prep session, so please help me to help you. And today's focus is going to be on, it's AP government, but today's focus is going to be on amendments and which ones you should know, how they apply to government, constitutional cases, Supreme Court cases that have come up about the amendments. With that being said, if you have any questions that are not related to our topic today, if we have some time at the end, I'll be happy to answer those. So anything about the AP test. I'm not going to answer questions about format necessarily because that's all in, you should have that information already, where you can go to the ETS College Board website to find that. So you're welcome, Peter. All right, so let's get started. And I'm going to, anytime you guys want to pop a question in to the chat, please do so. Or if you want to raise your hand, please do so. But questions in the chat might be better. And also, if you pop a question in the chat and I don't get to it immediately, I may be waiting to give you the answer later, or I may not have just heard it. So if you think I'm ignoring you, go ahead and I think that you're allowed to unmute and ask questions, so feel free to do that. Okay, let's get started. I'm gonna make sure, I want to make sure that everybody can see the screen. Let me try this again. Okay. All right, so here we go. All right, can everybody see the PowerPoint okay? If you can't see the PowerPoint, just type a message in the chat. Okay, great. All right, so AP US government, and our focus today is constitutional amendments and what you should know about them. A question arises, how do I memorize all these amendments? And how do I know, what's important? So that's some of the things we're going to address today. Part of the agenda is going to be looking at the most important ones. They're not all mentioned on the AP. We're going to look at the key meanings of these, and we're going to look at what amendments the left wingers like and which ones the right wingers like as well. So we'll do that as we're going along. We're going to talk a little bit about original intent versus the living Constitution. And so this also applies to the amendments. What was the purpose of these amendments when they started, as opposed to how they're being used now? And that goes along with federalism, because a lot of the issues have to do with states' rights. So that's interesting. It's going to be, I think, a very interesting topic. One way to help you memorize amendments over the course of the next few weeks before the test is to grab yourself one of these. This is a pocket constitution. Some of them look like this. Some of them have the front of the Constitution on it and some, but if you can get yourself one of these and just carry it around with you, I would say that it is well worth looking like a dork for a few weeks in order to make sure you get that 5 on the AP test and don't have to pay thousands of dollars for this course when you're in college. So I think it's well worth that. Anyway, so let's go ahead and get started and take a look at the groupings. How are these amendments grouped? So I'm going to show you some ways in which they're grouped. First of all, there's the Bill of Rights, which are the first 10 amendments, obviously. Then we also have the Reconstruction Amendments, which are 13, 14, and 15. We have the Progressive Amendments, 16, 17, 18, and 19. There are progressive amendments. There are amendments beyond that are arguably progressive, but they don't fall into the progressive era. So these are generally what are considered the progressive amendments. Also, you've got voting amendments, some of which could be considered progressive amendments. They expand, some of them expand democracy, and in that sense, it's progressive. So, and then we're going to take a look at some of the Supreme Court cases, the ones that you need to know for the AP exam that relate to the amendments. Okay, so let's take a look at our first the Bill of Rights, and we take a look at the First Amendment, and man, there's a lot of stuff in there. Freedom of religion. We have both Establishment Clause and the Free Exercise Clause. We have freedom of speech, press, assembly, and petition. And every one of these amendments has had some sort of Supreme Court case, and certainly numerous federal cases that have resulted regarding these, but not all of those cases are ones that you're going to need to know. And so there's not, for instance, really anything you need to know much about the quartering of soldiers, number 3. And a question is there any way we can have the slides? You can take screenshots of them. I'll be happy if I'm not sure if I'm allowed to. Well, actually, here's what's going to happen. My contact information will be given to you guys, or you should have a link to my profile. So you can send me a direct message, and I can send you a PDF with all the slides, or just a PowerPoint. So the answer is yes. But if you okay, here we go. You can hit www.wyzant.com and /match/tutor /88163642. So that's how you can get a hold of me. So I think everybody who's in here should be able to see that in the chat box. Okay, so back to the Bill of Rights. The freedom of religion is in 2 parts. You've got the Establishment Clause and the Free Exercise Clause. And it's important to understand that when the First Amendment was written, there were certain states, Rhode Island, for instance, that did not want to sign the Constitution unless they could guarantee that their state religion would not be infringed upon by the federal government. So the idea that the federal government, that a court could strike down prayer in school, for instance, or the 10 Commandments at a school, or whatever, would have appalled probably most of the founding fathers. They would have seen that as an intrusion of the federal government and the power of the federal government. Not all of them, but most of them would have seen it that way. And that was, recall that the first clause in there in the Bill of Rights reads, Congress shall make no law. So they're very much for limiting the power of Congress. And it goes on respecting an establishment of religion such as the Anglican Church, or prohibiting the free exercise thereof, such as the Puritans or whatever, or the Catholics, or whatever church you were from in England. So that was an important, that was the first thing in there, was religion. So it becomes a very important part, even for deists like Benjamin Franklin or Thomas Jefferson, who themselves may not have necessarily gone to church on Sundays. But this was an important issue, and to allow the states free reign. So this is one way that this has changed, that both the Establishment Clause and basically every other part of the First Amendment has changed to apply to local governments. Now, how has that happened? So a question is, how have these Bill of Rights, which for the most part were written only for the federal government to, in order to limit its power and to keep it from being able to intrude on the rights of free people, of U.S. citizens. What changed? You had a barrage of lawsuits over the last 100 years, particularly since the 1950s, that have made it so that the Bill of Rights, many of these rights now apply to states. Not all of them, but many of them. And one important thing to understand about how these things happen is that if the state passes a law that's unconstitutional, that law will still be followed until a court strikes it down as unconstitutional, be it a state court. Usually not, unless it's unless there's a state, unless it violates the state constitution. But it's usually the federal court that's going to strike it down. But unless somebody sues, unless there's a lawsuit, the courts are not going to come in and make an issue about it. Something has to be brought in front of the court in order for the courts to step in. So what gave the courts, and I'm going to ask you guys to put an answer in the chat, what gave the courts the authority to begin to rule on these issues regarding rights in the states? Anybody know? Okay, the answer is the 14th Amendment. The 14th Amendment, which we will get to in just a minute, but before the 14th Amendment, none of this applied to the states. So a state who wanted to ban guns could do so. A state that wanted to have a state religion in 1850 could do so. A state that wasn't following due process or wasn't giving all of its citizens the right to a speedy and public trial, or had excessive bail, or that sort of thing, that was the federal government could do nothing about it. So that was up to the states, to interpret to write their own constitutions and interpret. Now here's the interesting thing, that remember that as states came into the Union, the states had to present to Congress their constitutions, a brand new constitution. So every state after the original 13 had to admit an application to become a state, or every territory did, and that constitution had to be approved. So quite easily, the federal government could say, no, we don't like your constitution, so you're not in, sorry. So often the rights given to citizens in a state were very similar to the rights that were given in the Bill of Rights and the Constitution, but not always. And so that's an important point. And so there we have the issue of federalism, where one of the ways the federal government got states to conform to the spirit of the Constitution was by deciding whether or not they were going to be approved, or their state constitutions would be approved or not. This becomes a big issue for some of the original 13 after the Civil War, when states are being readmitted to the Union and the state governments don't like, the federal government doesn't necessarily like some of their constitution, and says, no, try again. So we look at Reconstruction, for instance, and we see that the first Reconstruction Amendment was the 13th, no slavery. Every state that wanted to be readmitted into the Union had to approve of that amendment, and they also had to write it into their constitution that slavery was not going to be part of their laws. They weren't going to have that. But when that still left discrimination open, and you saw that a lot of folks were still not allowing blacks to vote, intimidating them, not allowing them to elected representatives to sit, black representatives to sit on state governments. Then the 14th Amendment was basically forced onto these states, the southern states, and they were told, if you want to be readmitted, you've got to agree to the 14th Amendment, which is interesting because not all of the northern states ratified the 14th Amendment initially. So this meant that southern states were ratifying the 14th Amendment before. Now, the 14th Amendment, if we go back to the original 10 amendments, they can be almost the entire text of the amendments can be written on one page. It's difficult to write the entire text of the 14th Amendment on one page. It's convoluted. It's difficult to read, and I'm not saying that it's a bad amendment, but it was written somewhat in haste. It was passed somewhat in haste. Once again, it was ratified once the southern states had ratified it, but it still had not been ratified by all the northern states, or passed by all the northern states, but they had the requisite number of votes to ratify it, so it became law. And it's long, it has lots of parts to it, but the main point they were trying to make was that former slaves, and the main reason it was written was to protect former slaves, the freedmen. And it stated that all those born in the United States are citizens of the nation and of the states wherein they reside. Now, what does it mean to be a citizen of the state? This was never really defined by the Constitution, and this has been something that has caused a lot of issues, a lot of problems, a lot of argument and debate and controversy. What does it mean to be a citizen of the state? And does that mean that if I leave this state, then I'm no longer a citizen? Whereas we know that if you leave the United States and go to another country and live there for 20 years, you're still a citizen in the United States. So what exactly does that mean? That was kind of strange. But it basically was designed to keep people from discriminating against African Americans specifically, but just in general. Let's allow Americans to have the same rights. So this was called equal protection. In other words, if you are going to provide certain rights to white people, you have to provide these rights to everybody. Now, the way they got around this, of course, was one of the problems was it didn't specify a lot of things. So they were discriminating against people in the right to vote. Even states that passed laws that ensured that blacks could vote, you had this group called the Ku Klux Klan that went around menacing people and keeping them from voting. So that required the passage of the 15th Amendment. And then once again, these states that were trying to get back into the Union were told, sorry, you messed up. You're not fully back into the Union now. Now you've got to agree to the 15th Amendment. And I wrote this one out. What a lot of people will say that the 15th Amendment guaranteed the right to vote to all men. And that's not what it says. It says the right to vote regardless of race, color, or previous state of servitude. So that means that it doesn't say anything about gender in here. It doesn't say that you can't discriminate based on ethnicity. It doesn't. You could discriminate based on if you are Hispanic, for instance, or based on nationality, because race and color are and previous state of servitude are the key components to this one. And even with the 15th Amendment, of course, we know that there were a lot of Jim Crow laws and other laws that prevented blacks from voting, and we'll talk about some of those in a minute. But the 14th Amendment, which was passed to basically ensure that a state treated all its people the same, what it ended up doing and the interpretation that was that the much of the court has accepted 80, 90 years later, so starting in the 1950s and 1960s, are that the rights guaranteed to U.S. citizens are also guaranteed to state citizens. In other words, the Bill of Rights applies. Let me shut this. This is got a glare there. Okay, so we go back to the previous slide here, and we look at some of these rights, and we think about, okay, how do these rights apply now? And freedom of religion, once again, we don't see anything about freedom of religion applying to the states until we start to get into issues with the schools. Now, any idea why is it that the federal government can make rules that apply to the schools, but not necessarily a lot of other institutions? And we're looking at public schools, of course. Why is that? Any ideas, any thoughts on that? Well, public schools since the 1950s have received federal funding. And basically, it's not that a public school cannot violate the Constitution, because here is the thing: a public school can have prayer in school if it wants to. The public school can give every kid a Quran if they wanted to, and say, hey, read chapter 1, or read book 1, or read this part, or they can teach religion from a religious standpoint if they wanted to. But here's what happens if they do: they will lose federal funding. And because schools are part of school districts, generally speaking, most schools don't receive a check from the federal government. The school district does. So a school district that, let's say, has 15 schools as part of it, one of those schools does something, violates the establishment of religion clause. What happens then is that the entire district loses money. Now, it's not a ton of money. I think as of right now, schools only receive about 7% of their funding, give or take, a school district from the federal government, some more, some less. But part of that funding, for instance, at least since the 1940s or 50s, includes, actually, if we go back to the 50s, includes school lunches. So that means that all school lunches, the school lunch program, they wouldn't receive any money for that. So, okay, so question is, I'm still a little confused. How did the 14th Amendment give the judicial branch more power to determine things unconstitutional? So what the 14th Amendment basically did was it said that the freedoms that apply to, or at least this is the way the courts interpreted it, that freedoms that are guaranteed to U.S. citizens cannot be taken away from somebody by the state. So the fact that you are a citizen of Tennessee doesn't mean that Tennessee can run roughshod over the Constitution. They can't pass laws that are going to interfere with the Constitution. All right, so what happens then is that somebody in a public school, for instance, let's skip ahead to one of these cases, and let's take a look at, for instance, Engel versus Vitale, First Amendment. And so this was a prayer in school case, famous prayer in school case, 1962, where a student was punished for not praying in school, and the schools sued. The students sued the school system. And so up until then, a case really had not reached the Supreme Court. But at this point, the Supreme Court looks at the 14th Amendment and says, yes, what the 14th Amendment says. Now, here's the thing: a lot of legal scholars don't agree with this. So I'm just telling you what the court says. But the court at that time, and it was not a unanimous decision. I think it was a 6-3 decision, if I'm not mistaken. But the court says that the 14th Amendment means that this school that is receiving money from the federal government, even though they're not created by Congress, even though it's a state school, this school is receiving money from the federal government, and therefore the federal government has a jurisdiction over it in terms of these things. It cannot violate the First Amendment for students, and the state cannot violate the First Amendment for students. So that's where that comes from. I hope that answers the question. So we'll look at a couple other cases that are similar. The Tinker, a very famous case. By the way, so these Supreme Court cases you should know. These are all very important cases, and they'll they might not all appear on the AP test, but they're these are the ones that appear most often. So Tinker versus Des Moines Independent Community School District, another free speech case. This was Vietnam War, where kids were wearing black armbands and they were told they can't do that. That was disruptive to the school system. So this is a speech case, still First Amendment, but the other one, remember, was religion. This one is free speech. So this one says that what the school system basically says is, well, that doesn't apply here. Free speech doesn't apply here. I mean, we're in a learning environment. We have to make the rules here. And remember that when the way the courts have interpreted this, and this is important to understand, is that if a teacher says something to a kid, if a principal says something to a kid, even if a janitor says something to a kid, they are representative of that school. That school is part of a school district. And as far as I know, and I could be wrong, every school district in the country is funded by the state in which they reside. So basically, the janitor, the lunch lady, the teacher is a representative of the state. And so when they so very much so, of course, the principal will be. So if the principal is enforcing a law and saying a rule, you can't do this, then they're that's enforcing a state they're basically enforcing a state rule, and if the state doesn't like it, then the state needs to take care of that. But in this case, the state stood by Des Moines Independent School District, and Des Moines stood by the decision that the principal is right. What the Supreme Court ruled is that and this is pretty important, that your rights don't go out when you step into the school. Your First Amendment rights you're still guaranteed those as a U.S. citizen, as a minor, and when you step into the school, you still have those rights. Now, the school does have a compelling interest to keep order. So that was important too. And in some other cases kind of better defined what order meant. But that means that as long as you're not disrupting the school system, and the school can't, it's up to the school to prove that you're a disruption. It's not up to you to prove that you're not a disruption. It's up to the school to prove that you're the one who's disrupting. And as long as you're not disrupting, then you have First Amendment rights. So if you're sitting in class and you're disrupting the teacher, then and the teacher can't teach, then your First Amendment rights are quashed at that point, because you're not utilizing them as you should. But as I had a student, for instance, in my one of my government classes years ago, she would pull out a Bible in the middle of class and she would start reading to herself. She wouldn't read out loud. I never said a word to her. I would occasionally, I'd ask her a question and she would stop. She'd look up, she'd answer the question correctly, go back to her Bible, and what could I say about it? And when it was time to participate with other students, she'd put it away and do what she needed to do. So there you go. I mean, that's how that freedom of speech has to be, taken, and freedom of, and actually that's that gets into the free exercise of religion as well. But the First Amendment doesn't go out the window when you walk into the door. However, does the Second Amendment? That's an interesting one. If we look down at Mcdonald versus Chicago, so a kid gets charged with having firearms in a school. And so this is an interesting case, because now the case is about, they argued that, well, there's nothing in the Constitution keeping the kid, saying that a kid can't bring a gun to school. And there's nothing that, so the kid, and so once again, the 14th Amendment comes into place here, because the right to bear arms was originally intended for protection against the federal government, so that the federal government couldn't come and take your guns. It was not intended to protect against the state or the school or any organization necessarily from taking your guns. So, for instance, if a Walmart, and this is still the case, private individuals have a right to privacy. And then so if Walmart says you can't bring a gun in here, well, that then becomes an issue between the state government and, does the state government have a law that says that you have a right to carry your weapon wherever you want to? They could pass a law that says, no, you can't. A church, Walmart or whatever can say you have, you don't necessarily have, because once again, the right to bear arms is between the government and individuals. And it doesn't, and when you see a lot of these laws being applied to, or a lot of these rights being applied at the state level, it's not because of an organization, a person, or whatever saying, trying to take away your rights. It has to do with generally the government. One big exception, which is ironically the reason the 14th Amendment was passed, or one of the reasons, was because the Ku Klux Klan was taking away people's right to vote by saying, if you vote, we'll kill you. So that was so in that particular case, then yeah, it is about the states, about individuals, and about organizations trying to take your right away. Any questions up to this point? I know I've been giving you guys a lot of stuff, and I'm sort of jumping around from one thing to another, but any questions about anything that we've gone over so far? Okay, good enough. Let's keep going. So we're looking at looking back then at some of these rights, and one of the things I'll say, talking about which ones are going to be the most important and the ones that appear the most. First Amendment, you do need, I would say you need to know all 6 of these things. You've got freedom of religion, both the establishment and the free exercise of. You've got speech, you've got press, you've got assembly, and you've got petition. Right to keep and bear arms, you need to understand what that means. Originally, the original intent was so that, because there was supposed to be no standing army, the idea was that if we were attacked, that a militia could come together quickly and defend the nation against attack and create an army. For the most part, George Washington's army, they weren't supplying guns to the soldiers. They were bringing their own guns, or they were privately funded. John Hancock spent a whole lot of money. Washington himself, I believe, spent a whole lot of money on arms for men. So this was to allow individuals to do that. But then also there was that fear of an intrusive and oppressive government. So it wasn't about hunting, and it wasn't about keeping burglars out. But it's kind of become that in a way. No quartering your soldiers. Once again, that's not one that you need to know too much about. The Fourth and Fifth and Sixth Amendments are interesting, and there are cases that deal with those, which I've outlined, and I'll give that to you so you can take a look at that. But you do need to know those have become part of state. Most states have their own laws or their own Bill of Rights that protects these freedoms. So, and probable cause being an important one. Unreasonable search and seizures, and there's a lot of implications for students actually that are interesting. The right to remain silent, your Fifth Amendment, and the right to due process. So this due process clause becomes very important, and the application of this clause in the 14th Amendment to things like the things like voting and all of that. And for instance, if you're kicked out of school, then it's determined because the government is not allowed to take away your life, liberty, or property without due process of law. So what does that mean? It's been determined that by some federal courts that you have a right to an education, that education is in fact a property, and that if the government takes it away, they better have a good reason, and you have to go through a due process. And so that means that everybody is treated the same according to the 14th Amendment, equal protection with rights to due process of law. So that's why suspending somebody for more than 10 days or expelling a kid from school requires that everything be all right. And this is why schools sometimes get sued by parents of kids who've been suspended or expelled because they believe they've been discriminated against, and sometimes rightly so. So that one's an interesting one. Rights of the accused person. So due process of law is not just court. It can be anything in which your property, liberty, or life are taken from you. In the latter two cases, it would almost certainly be court. And then we get to the ninth one, and I want to talk about this one, and we'll probably leave you. I'll talk about the progressive amendments very quickly, and then I'll open it up to questions. So if we look at the Ninth Amendment and we look at Roe versus Wade, the Ninth Amendment basically says that I'll read it to you. The enumeration, meaning the numbering and pointing out in the Constitution of certain rights, shall not be construed to deny or disparage others retained by the people. Now, this is a problematic one, because it basically says just because we've named all these rights doesn't mean that the government can say, well, that one's not in the Constitution, so we can take away your right. So what are these rights? Well, we don't know. But the Ninth Amendment has determined that right to privacy is one. And the Supreme Court in a previous decision determined that a woman's right to contraception could be defined as right of privacy. And then that was furthermore applied to the right of abortion. And once again, so that's the 19th Amendment, but it's also the 14th Amendment, because again, this isn't Congress doing this. This is the state of Texas doing this. And so then it was applied to all the states. So that's how Roe v. Wade justifies The Supreme Court and this, I think, 7-2 decision justified that. Ninth and 14th Amendments. On this list of cases, I've got Shaw versus Reno. That's not that actually involves a lot of different things, so I didn't put any particular one for that. The United States versus Lopez involves the Commerce Clause. This is the federal government claiming the Commerce Clause versus the states claiming the 10th Amendment. So that one's a particularly interesting one that I think you should look at. All of these are ones that you should know very well. So I said that I would look at the progressive amendments really quickly. And one thing I want to mention about these, that the idea with progressivism, if you remember correctly, was that it had a lot of different facets to it. And what was progress for some people in the progressive movement was not progress for other people in the progressive movement. Income tax was an amendment that allowed income tax to pass. So the idea is that people would be taxed based on what they made, and the more they made, the more they would be taxed. And it allowed even for progressive income tax, which means the more money you make, the higher percentage you're taxed at. Well, that's not necessarily one that gives people freedom. It's one that arguably takes away money. Prohibition is the only one passed, arguably the only amendment passed that takes away freedom as well, which took away the right to drink. The direct vote of senators added freedom. The 19th says the right to vote regardless of sex. There could be other restrictions. One that is arguably also takes away freedom is the 22nd Amendment, presidential term limits, passed after Roosevelt was elected 4 times. And this one, by limiting a president's term to 10 years, in a way limits the voters' ability to elect the same person multiple times if they want to. So arguably that one limits rights of the electorate in a way. So these are the main ones that the ones that I mentioned are the ones that are mainly the ones that are going to be mentioned, but I there's some amendments on here that I haven't really talked about. These are the way mostly that you can think of the grouping, how to group these together. And if you can remember them in a group, and there's some that cross over various groups, like the progressive amendments along with the voting amendments, and 15 of course is a Reconstruction Amendment as well. I didn't mention the amendment. I didn't mention the 27th Amendment in here, the 25th Amendments in here. But if they are mentioned on the AP exam, then very likely they will be they will very likely be written out, so you don't necessarily have to memorize those. Let's see what percentage points you need for correct for a 5. I don't know the answer to that question. Yeah, I can't answer that, sorry. Okay. And yeah, I'll open it up for questions now. I know I didn't talk much about the right and the left, as I said I would. I think I ended up going too long on some other stuff, but if I have time, I'll go back to that. Questions about anything we've talked about right now today? Some people do ask, and the reason I wanted to bring it up is which are there particular amendments that Republicans or conservatives like versus liberals and Democrats? And the answer is yes. If we go back to the Bill of Rights, for instance, Republicans and Democrats tend to favor. Republicans tend to favor the establishment. The free exercise clause, whereas Democrats tend to use or call or invoke the establishment clause more often. The freedom of speech one can go either way. There are in the 1950s, 40s, 50s, 60s, and 70s, this was used a lot by liberals and Democrats. More often now, it's been used by Republicans and conservatives, claiming that their speech on college campuses have been restricted. OMB is the office. Let's see, the Office of Management. The OMB Office of Budget Management, but it's the Office of Management Budget, I believe. The right to bear arms is obviously a right-wing one. Republicans and conservatives like that one. Quartering of soldiers, kind of a non-issue. Search and seizures, both tend to support this. However, many conservatives who tend to be more law and order are sometimes skeptical of the use of this to prevent searches of criminals. Right to due process of law. Once again, conservatives and liberals both support these, but often you see more law and order conservatives who tend to say that sometimes you get people who are being released on technicalities and who committed crimes. And yes, you can receive a copy of the slides. If you look in the chat box, the original link sent was incorrect. So if you look at the link that's up there now, and if you click on that and you go there, I can send you I can send those to you. Okay. The freedom from excess bail, cruel and unusual punishments. Generally speaking, in the last few years, the movement to I should say in throughout most of the 20th century, the movement to reduce punishments has been most often a liberal cause, but in the last few years, there's been a lot of conservatives on the reform movement too. Liberals, however, tend to seek greater punishments for corporations and people who violate federal regulations. For instance, companies who are in violation of environmental or individuals who are in violation of environmental reforms and things like that. And then other rights of people, these have been invoked by both groups. Powers reserved to the states. 10th Amendment is not just states' rights, it's also individual and community rights as well. So this has been invoked more by conservatives than liberals, but again, liberals will invoke it as well. The 13th Amendment really, actually, there's an interesting issue about the 13th Amendment, where this won't appear on your AP test, but I think it's interesting. There was a case where somebody refused to refused to wait on somebody because of their because they were gay, I think it was, or refused to give service to someone because they were gay, and they were sued. And their argument was, and it's a pretty interesting argument, that that by being told by the state, because they violated a state law, being told by the state that they have to wait, that they have to provide service for certain people, violates the 13th Amendment, because the 13th Amendment actually says, well, I'll read it very quickly. Neither slavery nor involuntary servitude, except as a punishment for crime, shall exist within the United States. So involuntary servitude would mean that somebody who doesn't, or the argument is somebody who doesn't want to, because it doesn't say slavery, that part is not slavery, it's involuntary servitude. So if I'm being forced to work for you, and if I don't, then I lose my business, then that would be a violation of the 13th Amendment. That no court has actually ruled in favor of that, but it's an interesting argument for sure. Any others? Oh, by the way, so liberals tend to also like the use of the 14th Amendment in order to bring a lot of those constitutional Bill of Rights amendments to present day. So much of what conservatives tend to stand for is more of an original interpretation. What did the founding fathers think? What did they believe would be the right way to apply these? Whereas many liberals say, no, that doesn't really matter. We need to look at what's going on today. And it's a different day. Things are different. Different circumstances. So, any other specific questions or general questions? Well, all right then. If there are no further questions, I'm going to wrap up here. There was a question: do you teach any sessions provided? Any other sessions provided by Wyzant? I also do AP Spanish, actually. So that's the only other Wyzant. But I'm a Wyzant tutor, and I'm glad that you guys all made it onto the program today, and I appreciate your attendance. And I wish you guys the best. If you want to reach out to me after the tutoring session, you can contact me via the Wyzant link. If you're studying for other AP exams, please check out the 30 plus other free AP study sessions with Wyzant that's going to be happening over the next few weeks leading into May. Check the second link in the chat for more information about signing up. And thank you once again for joining me. Good luck with all your exams. Best of results to all of you guys. Have a great day. God bless you. Take care.